Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, it's Sean, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. Do you know the exact date that the Earth was created? If you lived in the 18th century, you would have learned that the world was created on Saturday, the 22nd of October, 4004 BC. And not just any moment on the 22nd of October, but on the beginning of the night. This idea of the Earth being just 6,000 years old is preposterous to us that live in the age of science. And we know that civilizations have existed long before that. But back in those times, the only geology textbook was the word of an Irish bishop called James Ussher. It was in this world that another James Hutton, came up with his theory of the Earth. James Hutton is called the founding father of geology, and in 1747, Hutton had just graduated from medical university, and he was this bright young man. But he also liked to socialize, and he liked to get drunk, and all of this drunkenness got him into trouble. He got his lover, Miss Eddington, pregnant, and this scandal caused her to be rushed away to London, where she gave birth. But for Hutton's family, this was a scandal. And so he had to get away from that scene. He had to go away from Edinburgh, which was a beehive of activity, to this small family farm in Slyhouses, Scotland. And it was at this damp, remote, seemingly boring place where he came up with the theory of how the Earth was formed. While observing the side of the hill, he noticed that there were bands in the cliff face. And over time, he realized that there were probably hundreds of bands of sediment that laid themselves one on top of the other, compacting into this factor that we call rock. Hutton's great insight was that the creation and destruction of the land wasn't one day in October 4004 BC, but instead a remarkably slow build-up over time. Today, in the world of science, we have a term for this slow build-up, and it's called sedimentary rock. So he mulled over these ideas for 15 years, then he tried to drum up enough courage, and finally he decides, okay, let me put this forward. So in 1785, he presents his radical idea to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It's a freakishly amazing idea. And Hutton wasn't sure that he wanted to go ahead with it, but his friends, they all loved the idea and they go, present it, and he did. And the society rejected his theory almost immediately. And as if that were not enough, the members of the society branded him as an atheist. Hutton was God-fearing, and he must have felt the sheer weight of how his ideas were not only being rejected out of hand, but that he was being drummed out of his religion. History is full of instances where ideas were too controversial to be accepted. And we have some examples like Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian physician, and he came up with this concept that you can save a lot of lives by washing hands, when you're dealing with patients. And they told him he was crazy. But then we have the story of geophysicist Alfred Wegener. And he came up with this concept of continental drift, and he was thoroughly rejected. Nicholas Copernicus was sidelined because he stated that the Earth was not the center of the universe. And today, we are faced with this skepticism. We present an idea, and people go, oh no, that doesn't work. So our ideas might not be as earth-shattering as these great scientists, but they're still very important to us. And the only problem we have is that our concepts are somehow slightly controversial. They're ideas that are very hard for the client to digest, and therefore we tend to stay on the safer, more boring side of life. But is there a way to present your controversial idea and not get in trouble? And what if you could do it in various media? Would it be possible to create an information product that went against the grain? What about a webinar or seminar that was a bit different from what the clients expected? In this series, we'll look at books, we'll look at articles, we'll even look at sales pages and see how you can take on the biggest and the most controversial point and give it its own spotlight. And we'll do it by using the power of objections. So let's find out how objections work and how and when to use them to maximum effect. As always, let's do this in 3 parts. Part 1, why you should not discard a controversial idea. Part 2, how examples and case studies and practical demonstration reduces pushback. And part 3, 3 real-life applications, articles, sales pages, and an info product, all 3 of them. Let's get started with the first one, which is why you should not discard a controversial idea. If I were to ask you what caused the slow decline of newspapers, your question would be slow because, at the turn of the century, newspapers were thriving and then, boom, they were gone. There was the internet, it was gone. And no matter who you speak to, you get the same answer. It's the internet. The news online is free, it can be accessed at will, it can even be tweaked to your own taste. There is also video, there's other interactive content, and then it's also searchable. And so most of us come to this seemingly logical explanation that was the internet. Internet was the most dominant factor in the decline of the newspaper industry. Except, there's a problem there. There's a neat little graph that tells a completely different story. And if you started that graph back in 1945, you'd notice that it goes down, 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 down. 1955, for instance, has fewer readers per household, but is a lot better than 1965, which is better than 1975. So what's happening here is 1945 newspaper circulation's going down, 1955, 1965, 1975, and as you hurtle through the years, the readership drops precipitously as we get to 1995. And if you're thinking internet at that point in time, not a lot of people had internet. You still had dial-up back then. So 1995 was already a death knell for newspapers, and the internet wasn't even around as it is today. In the book called The Content Trap, Professor Bharatanand brings up this concept that we'd consider to be quite odd, if not outright controversial. However, the very nature of the controversy is what jolts your audience to life. Because the book is showing you how content is not the solution to your problems. And all of us think, okay, we'll just create content and we'll be fine. And the book is The Content Trap. And here's where Bharatanand drives home that fact. And this doesn't have to apply to this big tome of a book. Let's say you went to something smaller, like an article, and it was about how to increase prices. Now, when you get into that article, you're not expecting to run into anything controversial, and yet in the first paragraph it says, here's how you decrease your prices. Now, that might seem controversial. It might ignore a much higher level of curiosity, but is this curiosity really necessary? Can we get across our ideas without having to raise hackles all the time? It really depends on the situation. Take, for instance, the formula that most marketers tend to follow. For at least 100 years or more, people have talked about this concept of target audience. You find that audience, it becomes your target, and once you know who you're targeting, You need to state the features and the benefits of your product. You need to state the features and benefits of your service. And that's that. So this sequence of events get your desired result, or maybe not, which is why we at Psychotactics ran into instant pushback. We started speaking at small events in Auckland and parts of New Zealand, and the earliest version of the brain audit had this safe concept of the target audience, not because of any reason, but because I didn't know any better. And it also had the concept of how benefits get people interested in your product. But then it swung the other way. It suggested that the most important element was the problem. Not only was the problem the most important, but it needed to show up before the solution, before any kind of benefit. Controversial ideas don't always land on fertile ground. With the brain audit, we did get people saying that they loved the idea of the problem. However, by and large, people felt that the entire concept was negative. Why do we need to use the problem, they would ask. They would say that the solution worked so well for so long, and then they had other objections, like what if the clients respond badly? Now, these aren't people that hated the brain audit outright. They liked the other parts of the brain audit, but the concept of the problem, that was too much, too jarring for them. What we tend to do is we go, okay, it's too jarring, let's get it out of the way. Let's not rock the boat here. But notice what your audience is doing. They're not rejecting you. They're not saying this won't work. They're not rejecting, they're objecting. They're saying, we can't see how this will work for me. And also, could you possibly be so kind as to give me some sort of proof, some sort of examples? Which is exactly what Bharat Anand does in his book, and he does so at many levels. So he talked about the graph of the newspaper circulation, remember? And he shows you that per household, for the past 70 years, it has been declining. Then he takes it further. He talks about a Norwegian media group, and it's called Schibsted. And Schibsted publishes newspapers too, but their cost had spiraled upwards, and their returns were horrific. Seemingly because of the invasion of the internet, they had lost over 200 million kroner. But by 2011, Schibsted had turned the ship around, and its operating profits were now up by 220 million, nearly 60% of the entire group. Bharat Anand realized that the controversy can be a friend. When you introduce a controversial idea, there's instant pushback, but also there's instant attention. The pushback is merely the objection, and this objection needs to be tackled. Once he was able to furnish the proof, that attention level morphs into intense curiosity. The reader or the audience, they want to know more because their worldview has not only changed, but now there's proof to back up that sudden change. When presenting the brain audit to a skeptical audience, I had the same aha moment. I could have presented just the problem as a secondary issue in the brain audit. But instead, we brought the problem up front and center as the most critical element. Now, that got the attention, but how do you sustain that attention? And what I'd do is I'd pick up a piece of paper, I'd crumple it into a ball, and that would get the audience's attention. But then I'd throw that ball towards the audience. Instantly, people would duck or they would swing their heads away from this oncoming missile. Without too much fuss, I was able to demonstrate how that ball of paper might get their attention. But when I throw that ball at them, more people react. So the problem, that was getting their attention and keeping their attention, and that's how that little demonstration was able to do it. It's more than likely that you do things that aren't run of the mill. And they might be controversial. So you think, wait, let's not stir the pot here. Let's stay on this straight and narrow and get the message across. And no, you shouldn't be doing that. You have the proof. You know that this factor is true, or you can find out how it is true. You have to understand that what's missing in this whole piece is just the objection. So if we go back in time to James Hutton and how he presented his proof, well, at first he couldn't prove anything. And so he ran into this wall of objections. But he found that proof and he reduced those objections. He finally got rid of the objections. And today, James Hutton is the great man of geology. And this is why controversy as a concept is so very powerful. You push it to your audience and they push back. They don't only push back, but they come up with every reason why your idea is nonsense. And as you get more objections, you are quickly able to figure out which one of those objections recur with the most alarming frequency. Now that's gold for you. Now you've got controversy, but you also know what's getting the most attention. And then you go out there, you get your proof, and you're able to reduce those objections, get rid of those objections. However, it's not always easy to overcome the skeptic, because one level of proof is not going to work most of the time. How much proof do you need? How do you present it? This takes us to our second part, and we'll look at examples, we'll look at case studies, we'll look at practical demonstrations, and we'll look at how all of these things, when put together in one package, it reduces pushback. So let's go to the next part and find out just how to go about it. What material makes up the rings of Saturn? Saturn rings were known for a very long time. Galileo Galilei discovered Saturn's rings in 1610, and yet by the mid-19th century, astronomers just knew that there were two concentric circles. They didn't know what those rings were comprised of. They also didn't know why those rings didn't disappear or float away. So 200 years had passed since Galileo, and the rings were still a mystery until a Cambridge college announced a competition. And they said, go out there, solve this mystery of the rings, and we'll give you a prize. However, they also wanted mathematical proof. And it's into this space that we have James Clerk Maxwell. James Clerk Maxwell was just 25 years old, and this physicist decided to take on the challenge, and he did so through the process of elimination. There were three hunches about Saturn's rings. One was that it could be solid rock or ice. The second was that it could be liquid-based. And the final possibility was that there were millions of these tiny particles floating around. You'd think that someone would go out there and get a telescope, a really powerful telescope. And Maxwell decides to use mathematics. Through maths, he decides that a solid ring would be bunched on one side of the planet. So that wouldn't work. And the liquid explanation didn't work either, because that would quickly be broken up by physical forces which were acting upon them. And this led to the final possibility, that the rings comprised of a large number of independent particles. What Maxwell did was to write an equation to tell you how many particles needed to be there in the system to make it stable. In short, James Clerk Maxwell used the power of demonstration to get his point across. The fact that he used complex maths to do it is fabulous, but it also underlines that we can overcome objections through three separate methods. The beauty of overcoming objections is that you can do it either by using just one or all three of the methods. So what are those methods? They are examples, case studies, and practical demonstration. Let's start out with the examples. Let's go right back to the presentation of the brain audit. Now, there I was presenting the brain audit, and there were a whole bunch of objections. People didn't want this whole problem thing. They didn't like it. And so we had to come up with this, roll the paper, throw it at the audience, and that seemed to work. However, that was just the starting point. Then I would slip into some examples. So I would say, let's say you were going out to dinner. Let's say you were wearing a white shirt or white blouse. And then at the dinner, as you're sitting there with this bowl of spaghetti and tomato and all that stuff, you slightly hit the plate and all of the spaghetti seems to come towards you, but you miss it, you avoid it. And then this tiny little fragment, tiny little drop, the tiniest possible thing gets on your shirt or blouse. And now you've got all of this white with this very tiny orange piece on that blouse or shirt. And you spend the rest of the evening trying to get rid of it. So that was an example of a problem. Then I'd give a second example of how you're driving down the road and you don't have a care in the world. You're looking at the trees, the passing scenery, and suddenly you see these red and blue flashing lights. And what do you pay attention to? To the scenery or the red and blue flashing lights? So what happened there was we were reducing that controversial concept by using examples, and examples that people could relate to on a day-to-day basis. And at least in this presentation, I was able to go further and talk about dog poo and how, you tend to watch for dog poo when on the street you could be watching out for men, women, flowers, all that kind of stuff as you're down the street. And yet your focus goes on the dog poo. And that represents a problem. And then I would bring it back to the concept of how this problem gets our attention, gets the brain's attention, and so then we would tie that back into the brain audit. But practical examples are not everybody's cup of tea. So people want proof. They want some kind of documentation. Did anyone in science do this? As if that were more important. But so there is always some scientist working on something, which is good. And luckily, there is proof everywhere. And when I was writing the brain audit, I ran into this very interesting experiment by Dr. John Cacioppo. The late Cacioppo was a neuroscientist, and he showed his subjects different sets of pictures. So the first picture was something positive, like a red Ferrari or a delicious pizza. And the second picture would be something mundane, like light bulbs or a plate. And the third would be a picture of a dead cat. In that presentation, I tell the story of how Cacioppo would record the electrical activity of each participant's cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex, in turn, reflects the magnitude of the information processing taking place. And then what I tell the audience is what Cacioppo found. The brain reacts more strongly to stimuli. And this is not just any stimuli, but stimuli that it deems problematic. Or to put it another way, when faced with a problem versus solution, the problem gets our attention. This cat versus plate versus Ferrari was a case study that completely reduced, watered down that objection, but it did so from another angle. The first time we did it with a bunch of examples, the second was some sort of science and proof, but the third one is practical demonstration. The crumpled paper was one of the ways to demonstrate the power of the problem. But then I'd do something else. I'd put chairs between the participant and me, and then I'd ask the participant to walk towards me. In every instance, they would swerve past the chair. And I'd turn to the audience and say, why did they swerve? Why didn't they hit the chair? And the audience would say, that's obvious, because if you go straight in the chair, you get your knees hurt, and that's not a good idea. So now you've demonstrated that the brain is focusing on that chair as a problem, an obstacle, a barrier, and you're going around it. So the problem comes first, you identify the problem, then you go around it. Slowly but surely, the audience would have enough examples to hold on to, enough proof, and therefore something that started out being very controversial was then quickly accepted. And we know this to be true because back then we would sell books at the back of the room. So, 50 people in a room, we'd say, okay, we're selling this book, who wants to buy it? And about 35 people will buy it. So it swayed at least 35 people in the room. The others didn't buy it for whatever reason. But the point is that almost 100% of them were on the other side of the fence and they come on this side of the fence. And this is true for almost everything that you do. You have this controversial idea. You have this idea that you know is interesting, more powerful, will have more curiosity, but then you don't push it because, hey, it's going to get people upset. What you really need to do is to have the objections, and then you need to have these three ways, which is examples, demonstration, and some proof if you have the proof. Pushback isn't always permanent. In most cases, you have to look at the objections and look at them as your guiding light. They're telling you exactly why people get edgy, why they get all frustrated and upset when you bring up your idea. Instead of trying to evade the objection, hug that objection tightly. Then take those objections, and there might be many, and find the examples, find the case studies, find the demonstrations to drive home your point. What was really tricky subject matter when I first started out has now become accepted by most of our clients. And the best way to look at how many ways it is being split up into examples and demonstration stuff is to pick up your copy of the Brain Audit. You already have it. Just pick it up and go through the pages, and you go page after page after page after page. You wouldn't have realized it when you were reading it, but it's there. All of these three elements are there: the examples, the demonstration, and the proof. We have covered two parts so far. We looked at part one, which is why you should not discard a controversial idea. In part two, we looked at how examples, case studies, and practical demonstration reduces pushback. So what is part three? In part three, we look at real-life applications. We'll look at an article, we'll look at a sales page, we'll look at an info product. But that's too much to fit into this podcast, so let's do that in the next episode, shall we? Let's just summarize what we've covered so far. The first part that we covered was the whole controversy and how we tend to walk away from it, even though we are pretty confident that our idea is good. Don't walk away from it. Take it head on. But create that second level. And that's what we covered in the second part, is that you need to have examples, you need to have demonstration, and you need to have some scientific proof. Doesn't always have to be important, that third part, the scientific proof, but it's nice if you have it. People like to see stats. They love to see graphs. They love to see all of the stuff that is somehow on paper that some scientist did somewhere. Okay? So if you can find that, go for it. There are people that do this research for you. You have to pay them, but they do the research for you. I think there's some Google research thing where they'll go and find this information for you. So all of this thing is very doable, and if you've got an idea, then you stick with that idea and you come up with that demonstration and those examples and the proof. But what is the one thing that you can do today? The one thing that you can do today is to find out the objections, because that's what's stopping the controversial idea from going ahead. So you've got some idea and people are going, no, I've already seen that before. I've already done that before. Or, that's too preposterous. Great. Now we're right on target, because now what you have to do is you find those objections. You're selling a product, you're selling a service, you're selling training. People have objections. Don't go around those objections. Go headlong into those objections. And that's what makes it interesting, because once you are able to get on those objections and you're able to reduce that objection or even destroy that objection, now you've got this very high level of curiosity. And that's what we use with almost all of our products and services. We're going to talk about that in the next episode. So that brings us to the end of this episode. What's happening in psychotactics land? This morning I was up at 3:30 a.m. I know, even earlier than usual. But a thought crossed my mind. I have been relatively grumpy and not quite the person I was in the last year and a half. And so I started to think at that point of the morning, why did I get this way? Or how have I suddenly slipped back? And it correlates exactly to what I have not been doing. And that is, I stopped meditating. Somehow it slipped out. I used to have an alarm. So most people use an alarm to wake up, and I use an alarm to sleep. So when I put the alarm, I know the alarm is going to trigger at some point, and I know that it'll wake me up with the meditation. And so that's how my meditation is linked. Well, I haven't put that alarm for a couple of months. And at least for me, that's my source of grumpiness, because I don't have this battery. There's a reserve battery. And yeah, that's that. So anyway, to get on with what's really happening in psychotactics land, the uniqueness course, the home study of the uniqueness course, is out on the 23rd of September. Now, there are some goodies on the page itself. So go and look for uniqueness among the products section of psychotactics. And what you'll find is there are a whole bunch of goodies that you can get even if you don't buy the course. And these goodies are really good. That's why they're called goodies. This home study is available on the 23rd of September. However, you have to be on the waiting list. You have to have signed up to that goodies list. So go there today, and on the 23rd of September, if Renuka has approved you, then you will get a notification. You'll be told whether you've been pre-approved. On the 13th of October is the big one. That's the article writing home study that a lot of you have been waiting for. So only 35 copies, that's all we sell. And once they're done, they're done. We know that it's a digital product, but we choose to sell just 35 copies at a time. Then we close it. Yes, it's creating scarcity. Yes, it's creating urgency. And I hope you're taking notes, because that's what you need to do in your business as well. So that's the 13th of October for the article writing and 23rd of September for uniqueness. And that's it. It's a wrap. We're done with this episode, which is part 1 of how to present a controversial idea to your clients and get very high curiosity levels. And then we'll go to part 2 next time. So stick with us, and we'll be back next week. Still listening? We sold the Info Products course this week, again 35 copies, and then we stopped. And it was a really funny rollout. So here's what happened. Renuka announced the Info Products course, and clients went on the waiting list, and then Renuka changed her mind. So she decided that she was going to give away some goodies. So she had already created this waiting list with a specific date, and people were waiting for that date. At that point in time, she now had to create a second waiting list. And so the info products got sold in 2 batches because of what Renuka decided to do in between. She changed the strategy in between because she decided to give some goodies as well. And so we had 2 separate info product dates or sale dates. So why is this so interesting to you? Well, it just shows you that while you might think that we're running almost a flawless strategy, which I doubt you are, but just in case you are thinking that, we tend to make all of these goof ups along the way, and then it's like driving a car. You know, someone cuts in front of you and then you have to react. And sometimes we drive or we cut in front of each other, and so we have to react and we have to take corrective action. It's worked out fine. It's worked out fine ever since we started. What I'm saying to you is, if you think that you have to have a perfect strategy, everything has to work well. That's not how it works. That's never how it works. So with that happy note, let me get this podcast out so we can start on the next one. I'll say bye for now, and I'll see you in 5000 BC, won't I? Bye.